we're about to turn a corner and talk about some things that are highly philosophical as opposed to science, right? We've talked about the cosmological evidence, we've talked about the biological evidence, the evidence from neuroscience and mind and free agency, but now we're going to talk about something that really hits home for me as a detective. We're going to talk about the moral evidence. The moral evidence. I can tell you, I spent a couple of years working gangs in South Central Los Angeles area. And I met a lot of interesting people doing that. And one of these interesting people was a gangster who ended up torturing a fellow gangster because that fellow, not in his gang, a different clique, so it was another gangster across town, that he ended up torturing because that gangster had kind of said some suggestive things to his sister. He took offense to that. Well, when we finally took him to custody and we talked about this with him, he didn't see anything wrong with what he had done. As a matter of fact, he suggested this was really the law of the streets, that if he had done that to his sister, he would have expected that guy to come and do that to him. For this guy named Jesse, he really felt like this was part of a moral code that was entirely appropriate. He accepted this as proper, virtuous behavior given the law of the street that he actually lived. Now, I will tell you that even in his situation, there were some people who reigned over his moral law. So, for example, he would never do anything to break the law of his clique, his gangsters, his fellow gangsters. They had a moral code, and Jesse knew that he had to bend his knee to that moral code. And even though they might have been gangsters living in our city, they also knew they would get a ticket if they parked someplace on the city they shouldn't park. So even that gangsters, they would say, hey, in that gang, they would not break the city municipal codes because they didn't want to have their cars towed. So there's still an overarching authority even over the gang, and the gang is overarching over Jesse. And in the city of Los Angeles, I mean, we have to kind of bend our knee to several laws and restrictions that are offered by the state of California. So there's an overarching hierarchy of law from the state of California that's over the city of Los Angeles, which is over the gangster group that Jesse was a part of. And you can see how you could extend this out. And see, there's a hierarchy of law. There's national laws that govern all the states. Some people would argue that there's international laws that govern nations. I get that. The question is, how far does this hierarchy go? Does it stop at some point? Where are moral laws grounded? Can these be explained by staying inside the room of the universe? Or is there some better explanation for the overarching moral laws? Look, to begin with, we would say that there are some objective moral truths. And if you wonder what those are, simply add the expression "for the fun of it" behind any crime. So, for example, you might say it's okay to lie to achieve a greater end. If I've got to lie in order to steal, to prevent 1 million people from being destroyed by a terrorist, if I need to steal in order to steal a code so he can't push the button to destroy 1 million people, well, I could justify this in some way. But if you put the expression "for the fun of it" behind lying, suddenly you've discovered an overarching, objective, moral truth claim that is true for all of us. It's never okay, it never has been okay, to lie for the fun of it, to steal for the fun of it, to kill for the fun of it. Put the "for the fun of it" on your sentence, and suddenly you've discovered a number of objective, transcendent moral claims, moral truths, moral obligations. So we know these things exist. The question is, how do we ground them? I can tell you I was an atheist for 35 years, and I think I behaved morally most of the time. Of course, but I'm the judge of that, right? How do I ground my moral behavior? I might know not to hurt somebody, but how do I ground it? How do I describe where that comes from, where that overarching, objective, transcendent moral truth comes from? You can behave well, but not know why you're behaving well or how it's grounded. So for me, I, at some point as a detective, wanted to know, well, where do these moral truths come from? Are they there's only a couple of options. If I'm going to explain moral truths from inside the room of the universe, then I have to use the stuff that's available to me. Space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry, and also the beings that emerge from space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Perhaps all moral laws are simply a matter of personal opinion. That is one way that people try to explain moral laws, by staying inside the room of the universe. But if that's the case, and you disagree with me on a moral issue, how do we adjudicate between the two of us? You have to say that you're right and I'm right, even though we completely disagree on this moral claim. because we could never adjudicate. There's no one who stands above the individual person if all moral laws come from individuals. That doesn't seem to work, and we know that doesn't work practically. Well, perhaps it's groups of individuals. That would also be inside the universe, right? So it's still going to come from individuals, but now in large groups. We obey certain rules, certain laws, certain predispositions, moral predispositions, because as a group we have decided together to obey that moral law. Okay, but then what happens then when we have two different groups that disagree on a moral truth? Well, how are we able to tell the Germans in World War II that their atrocious treatment of Jews in prison camps is not okay? They would say, well, in our culture, this was okay. So if cultures decide what's okay, well, we're okay. Well, no, we said there's a law above the law. There's a law that's overarching above both of us, and we have to obey that law. Well, how do we explain that? If it's not coming from individuals, and it's not coming from groups of individuals, from where else can it come? Now remember, the important thing here is that I don't think I have any moral obligations to this clicker. I don't have any obligations to my coat. You don't have moral obligations to inanimate physical objects. All moral obligations are between persons. So whoever is the source of these moral laws, that has to be a person. You are also not morally obligated to physics. But moral obligations drive us to look for the moral person that is the foundation for moral law. If we can't stay inside the room to describe the source for morality from persons or from groups of persons, there does seem to be one other option that some people have gravitated toward, and that is it perhaps a product of our biology? Is it perhaps, as Sam Harris would say, writing about this, the neuroscientist and philosopher who's also an atheist, that this is simply a matter of our biology, our common, overarching human desire to flourish? Well, okay, so is human flourishing, human well-being, the overarching source of moral law? Okay, what do you mean by flourishing? Do you mean survival? Because clearly, I've seen people behave very, very poorly in history as groups or as individuals, and it has actually aided in their survival. You can behave atrociously and improve your survival chances. But I think most people will say, well, yeah, but that's not human flourishing. There's a certain kind of survival that we would say is well, is good, is virtuous, it aids well-being. It aids your flourishing. But there's the problem. If you're going to say there's a certain kind of survival, you have to start with a moral notion that you haven't earned yet. You have to start, because remember, if all moral notions are simply aiding your survival, no, flourishing, a certain kind of survival, well, now you're stealing a moral idea that precedes your idea of flourishing. So it's kind of a cheat, if you think about it, to say that it's human flourishing that drives our moral behavior, because you've got an idea in your mind about what that is. And your idea is full of moral content, but if moral content comes from flourishing, it can't precede flourishing to describe it. Do you see the problem? So when we try to stay inside the room of the universe to describe where objective, transcendent moral law comes from, where moral truth comes from, most of these explanations will not get it done. Well, none of them will get it done, and none of them also will point back to the person to whom we feel obligated. If there are objective, transcendent, moral laws and obligations, who is the objective, transcendent, moral lawgiver to whom we feel obligated? It can't be a what, because we're not morally obligated to what's. We're only morally obligated to who's. The best explanation for the moral truths that we feel press upon us inside the room is a lawgiver, a personal lawgiver that's outside the room. And the laws we feel, the obligations we feel in the room are not his creation, his willy-nilly creation. And they're not also the things that he just recognizes and tells us. No, instead they are a reflection of his holy moral character. An all-powerful God has the ability to eliminate moral imperfection. And if he can do that, he becomes a standard we can trust and stand on. So now we've looked at our evidence, right, in the room. We've started to develop a suspect description, given all the cosmological evidence, the biological evidence, all the mental evidence, and now one piece of the first half of the moral evidence. And what we see is we're looking for, again, that all-powerful first cause, that's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, that is the designer that fine-tunes the universe, authors life, is responsible for the design we see in life, who creates as a mind freely beings in its image that also are minds who act freely and feel morally obligated because we have an author. We have a reflection of God's holy nature in the universe that we sense, even if we don't believe. We sense that and we respond accordingly. The best explanation, once again, is outside the room.